Imagine watching your newborn sons, tiny and fragile, turn a deathly shade of purple right before your eyes. Now, imagine the only thing stopping doctors from saving them isn't medicine, but a clipboard. I begged, I pleaded, I offered them every penny I had, but the hospital administrator just took another bite of her sandwich and told me, rules are rules. They were about to find out that a desperate father doesn't follow rules. My world, as I knew it, ended in the sterile fluorescent glare of a hospital room. The story of my worst experience with the healthcare system began not with a bang, but with a series of missed whispers. Throughout my wife's pregnancy with our twin boys, a shadow loomed, completely undetected by the string of physicians who assured us everything was perfect. They missed the time bomb ticking inside her chest, pulmonary hypertension, a brutal heart condition that claims the lives of nearly a third of mothers during childbirth. We were blissfully ignorant, planning a future that was about to be stolen from us. The revelation came crashing down when she went into labor 12 weeks ahead of schedule, a chaotic whirlwind of panic and fear that ended with her in a medically induced coma and me standing on the precipice of hell. As if that wasn't enough, our boys, Ethan and Lucas, entered the world not with a cry, but with a terrifying, silent struggle. Their skin was a deep, alarming shade of blue, a color that screamed for oxygen they couldn't get. They needed the neonatal intensive care unit, the NICU, immediately. It was their only hope, their only chance at a first breath, a first day, a life. But the hospital, this supposed sanctuary of healing, had other priorities. They couldn't be moved, not 1 inch, until our insurance provider gave the green light. I stood before the unit administrator, a woman named Mrs. Miles, and tried to explain the sheer insanity of her request. An authorization like that could take days, a lifetime in the calculus of a newborn survival. My sons are purple, I stammered, the words catching in my throat. She offered a sigh that was a masterclass in bureaucratic indifference. I understand your concern, sir, but rules are rules. Her eyes were cold, devoid of empathy, as she delivered the next blow. Without prior authorization, you would be personally liable for a bill in the vicinity of $400,000. She said it so casually, as if discussing the price of a car, not the lives of my children. She didn't even glance at the 2 tiny, struggling forms in the incubators. The frantic, syncopated beeping of their heart monitors was the soundtrack to my unraveling. I did the only thing I could think of. I fell to my knees, the cold linoleum a shock to my system. Please, I begged, my voice cracking. Look at them. Just look at them. They're dying. For a fraction of a second, her gaze flickered towards the boys before snapping back to me. Sir, becoming emotional is not going to change hospital protocol. I suggest you contact your insurance company. My hands trembled so violently I could barely grip my phone, my fingers fumbling on the screen as I tried to dial. The world seemed to warp around me. My babies were suffocating, and I was being put on hold. 20 agonizing minutes passed, filled with the grotesquely cheerful hold music of the insurance company. Each Johnny note was a dagger in my heart as I watched Lucas's heart rate plummet on the monitor. 180, 140, then a terrifying 110. Across the room, Mrs. Miles sat at her desk, calmly eating a sandwich. The phone was still pressed to my ear, the hold music a relentless torment. I couldn't take it anymore. I ran to her desk. Please, just start the treatment. I pleaded, my voice raw. I'll pay cash. I'll sell my house, my car. I will sign anything you want. She took another deliberate bite of her sandwich before answering. Sir, even if you produced $400,000 in cash this very second, we are legally unable to accept it without first processing it through your insurance. It's a measure to prevent fraud. Her detachment was monstrous. It was then that a young nurse, her face pale with horror, finally broke ranks. Mrs. Miles, those babies might not have an hour. The administrator's eyes narrowed into slits. Jennifer, you are already on probation. One more word out of line, and you'll be terminated. The nurse, Jennifer, fell silent, but her body shook with silent, helpless sobs. The waiting room was no longer a place of quiet anticipation. Other parents, drawn by the commotion, were now recording the scene on their phones, their faces etched with disbelief. One father stood up, his voice booming with outrage. Lady, what in God's name is wrong with you? That was all it took. Mrs. Miles picked up her phone and called security. I need these disruptive individuals removed from the administration area immediately. Defeated, I stumbled back to my sons. Ethan was completely still now, a resident Dr. Kim, was there, a manual resuscitation bag in his hands, rhythmically pumping air into Ethan's lungs. He saw the despair in my eyes and leaned in, his voice a low whisper. "I'm buying you time, but I can't perform the procedures they need. They'll take my license." Just then, a voice from my phone, a bored-sounding representative, finally came on the line. He informed me that the case would need to be reviewed. "It's a Saturday, sir. Our medical review board doesn't convene again until Monday morning." Monday. The word was a death sentence. Monday. I screamed into the phone, the sound tearing from my throat. "They will be dead by Monday." His reply was a canned, infuriatingly calm. "I understand your frustration, sir." I ended the call and immediately dialed back, this time demanding, begging, to speak to his supervisor. I was rewarded with another 30 minutes of that soul-crushing hold music. In that time, Lucas began to have seizures. They were tiny, violent convulsions that racked his less than 2-pound body, a horrific dance of a nervous system in crisis. Mrs. Miles approached again, her face a mask of stern disapproval. "Sir, if you continue this disruptive behavior, I will be forced to have you removed from the premises." I pointed a shaking finger at my convulsing son. "My babies are dying." She didn't look at him. She looked at a tablet in her hands. "Your babies are stable. They are receiving basic supportive care." I gestured wildly at the chaotic symphony of alarms from their monitors. "Stable? You call this stable?" She glanced at her device again. "According to our internal metrics, their vitals are within acceptable parameters for their gestational age and condition." Dr. Kim, who had been silently working on Ethan, finally snapped. "Margaret, for the love of God, those are adult parameters. These are 28-week preemies. Their lungs will collapse permanently if they don't get surfactant therapy right now." She turned on him, her voice dripping with ice. "Dr. Kim, you are speaking far outside the scope of your authority. Do I need to report this conversation to the Chief of Staff?" More than an hour had passed since my boys were born. They were on the maximum level of oxygen support the hospital was willing to provide, and it wasn't enough. They were failing. I saw other doctors and nurses walk past the room, their gazes lingering for a moment before they shook their heads and hurried away. Everyone knew. Everyone was a bystander to a tragedy, watching 2 infants die, not from an incurable disease, but from paperwork. In my haze of grief and rage, I felt a gentle tug on my sleeve. It was an older janitor, his face etched with a sorrow I was beginning to understand. "My granddaughter," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "She died in this hospital last year. Same story. Waiting for insurance." He leaned closer. "There's an ambulance bay around back. Sometimes they leave the keys inside." The thought was a bolt of lightning in the fog of my despair. There was no hesitation, no second-guessing. I ran to my wife's room, leaned down, and kissed her forehead, her skin cool and still. "I'll be back," I whispered, a promise I wasn't sure I could keep. I ran. I ran through the labyrinthine corridors of the hospital until I burst through a set of double doors into the cool evening air. The ambulance was there, just as he'd said, and the keys were in the ignition. My hands, which had been shaking uncontrollably just an hour before, were now perfectly steady. My body was thrumming with a potent cocktail of pure adrenaline and white-hot rage. I fired up the engine and drove the ambulance directly onto the curb and up to the emergency entrance, the tires screeching in protest. I left it running and sprinted back inside, past security guards whose brains were still trying to process what they were seeing. Dr. Kim saw me coming and knew instantly. Without a word, he began detaching the incubators. "I didn't see a thing," he announced loudly to the room, then dropped his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "Children's Hospital, 12 blocks north. I'm calling them right now." Mrs. Miles came charging down the hall, her face contorted with fury. "Stop. This is theft of hospital property. This is kidnapping." Dr. Kim was already loading the second incubator into the back of the ambulance. I turned and looked her dead in the eye. "Swim me. Arrest me. I don't care anymore." Her voice rose to a shriek. "You are destroying your life. You will go to prison. You will lose everything." I gave a bitter, humorless laugh. "I'm about to lose everything anyway." 2 security guards finally arrived, but Dr. Kim positioned himself between them and the ambulance. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice calm and authoritative, "please help me secure these incubators. These infants are in critical distress." Mrs. Miles was apoplectic. "Don't you dare. You are all witnesses to a felony." One of the guards, an older man with kind eyes, looked from the tiny, blue babies to the administrator's furious face. He took a step back. I don't see anything, ma'am. I'm on my break. He turned and walked away. His partner hesitated for a second, then followed him. I jumped into the driver's seat and peeled out of the hospital entrance. Those 12 blocks were the longest and shortest of my life. I didn't know how to turn on the sirens, so I just laid on the horn, weaving through traffic like a madman. In the back, Dr. Kim was manually ventilating Ethan, whose lungs had finally given out completely. I could see the entrance to Children's Hospital approaching and slammed on the brakes, the ambulance lurching to a stop. Before we were even fully stationary, Dr. Kim was out the back doors, still rhythmically squeezing the bag, a human lifeline for my son. I grabbed Lucas's incubator and ran behind him. The automatic doors slid open to reveal a scene of controlled chaos. A triage nurse looked up, her eyes widening as she saw the incubators and Dr. Kim's desperate efforts. She didn't ask for a name or an insurance card. She just started shouting for a neonatal crash team. Suddenly, we were surrounded. People in scrubs materialized from every direction. They didn't ask questions. They didn't present us with clipboards. They just took my sons and disappeared with them through another set of doors. A woman in blue scrubs seamlessly took over the resuscitation bag from Dr. Kim, rattling off a string of medical jargon I couldn't comprehend as they wheeled the incubators down a long hallway. Dr. Kim placed a steadying hand on my shoulder for a brief moment before he followed them. The strength that had propelled me this far evaporated all at once. My legs gave out, and I had to brace myself against a wall to keep from collapsing. The full weight of my actions came crashing down on me. I had stolen an ambulance. I had left my comatose wife all alone, and my boys, despite everything, might still be dying. A security guard approached, his expression more concerned than accusatory, and asked about the ambulance blocking the entire emergency bay. Dr. Kim reappeared just then, his face grim but focused, and told the guard it was an authorized critical care transport. The guard looked at my disheveled state, then at Dr. Kim's scrubs, and simply asked if someone could move it. Another guard, seeing I could barely stand, volunteered to take care of it. They guided me to a chair, and someone pressed a cup of water into my hands. And that's when the thought of my wife hit me like a physical blow. She was back at that other place, unconscious, vulnerable, and completely alone. The choice I had made, the impossible choice between my dying children and my dying wife, tore through me with a fresh wave of agony. A nurse noticed my distress and sat down beside me. She didn't speak, just handed me a box of tissues. An hour, or maybe it was a lifetime, later, a doctor emerged. She introduced herself as Dr. Frances Steele, the chief neonatologist. She explained that they had successfully intubated both boys and administered the surfactant my sons had so desperately needed. Lucas was still experiencing seizures, but they were working through different medications to control them. She was direct, and I was grateful for it. She didn't offer false hope. The next 48 hours, she explained, were critical. Both boys had suffered grade 2 brain bleeds, a consequence of their premature birth, compounded by the prolonged oxygen deprivation. But they had a chance. For the first time that day, they had a real chance. Soon after, a hospital administrator appeared with a thick stack of paperwork. She was the antithesis of Mrs. Miles. Her voice was gentle, and she assured me that treatment had already begun and they would sort out the insurance complexities later. I signed form after form, my signature a barely legible scrawl from my still shaking hands. "Don't worry about the bills right now," she said kindly. "Just focus on your sons." A nurse then led me through the meticulous scrubbing ritual required for NICU entry. For 3 full minutes, I scrubbed my hands and arms with a strange-smelling antiseptic soap. She handed me a sterile gown and then took me to see them. Seeing them in their isolettes, these tiny, fragile beings encased in plastic and surrounded by a web of wires and tubes, broke my heart all over again. The nurse patiently explained the purpose of each machine, each beeping monitor, each blinking light. The blue light for jaundice, the ventilator tube, the feeding tube that went through their nose. She pointed out the normal ranges for their heart rate and oxygen saturation, numbers that would become the new center of my universe. I tried to absorb it all, but my brain felt fractured, unable to hold on to new information. From a small, quiet waiting room, I called my parents. The story came out in a disjointed, panicked torrent of words about the early birth, the coma, the ambulance. My mom just kept repeating, "We're on our way. We're coming right now." In the background, I could hear my dad grabbing his car keys. My next call was to my wife's sister. Her immediate sobs on the other end of the line were a painful echo of my own. She promised she'd be there in 2 hours. Later that evening, my heart sank when two police officers arrived. They wanted to discuss the unauthorized use of an emergency vehicle. Dr. Kim was still there, a guardian angel in scrubs, and he explained the dire medical necessity of my actions. They took copious notes, their expressions softening as the story unfolded. One of the officers shared that he'd had a preemie himself years ago. They said a report had to be filed, but the threat of immediate arrest seemed to have faded. The next morning, I was woken from a fitful sleep in a chair beside the incubators by a woman named Dina Lambert from Child Protective Services. She explained that the circumstances, the police report, the kidnapping, had triggered a mandatory review of my fitness as a parent. She was polite, but her questions felt like an interrogation. As I answered her inquiries about our home life and financial stability, my eyes were glued to the monitors. Lucas started to seize again. A nurse rushed over, administering medication through his fore as I described our support network to the social worker. It was the third medication they had tried for the seizures, and it wasn't working. Dr. Steele observed the monitor for a few tense moments until the tiny convulsions finally subsided. "The seizures are getting shorter," she told me, her voice gentle. "That's a small victory." Ethan, she added, was responding well to the surfactant, but still relied on the ventilator for every single breath. The next few days melted into a surreal routine governed by the rhythms of the NICU. Nurse shifts changed at 7 a.m., and 7 p.m. doctor's rounds were at 9 a.m. I learned the language of the alarms, which ones signaled a life-threatening emergency, and which ones merely meant a sensor had slipped off a tiny foot. A kind, patient nurse named Beth taught me how to change their diapers, which were no bigger than the palm of my hand, through the small portholes of the incubators. She showed me how to use comforting touch, gentle, steady pressure, so they would know I was there. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Dr. Kim, asking for an update. I sent him a picture of the two monitors, their heart rates and oxygen levels holding steady. He replied with a simple thumbs-up emoji. I knew he had risked his career for my family, and the weight of that sacrifice was immense. On their third day of life, they took Lucas for a brain scan. Dr. Steele later showed me the images on a computer screen, pointing to the shadowed areas that indicated the bleed. It was grade 2, she explained, which carried a chance of healing on its own. Ethan's lungs were showing slow improvement, but he was having frequent episodes of bradycardia, where his heart rate would drop dangerously low. The nurses would have to gently stimulate him, rubbing his back or feet to remind his body to keep his heart beating. Every piece of good news seemed to be tethered to a piece of bad. That afternoon, the billing office called. The woman on the phone explained they were invoking emergency protocols to override the insurance delays. Apparently, Children's Hospital demanding answers from our provider carried a lot more weight than a desperate father. Suddenly, the insurance company was being remarkably cooperative. The hypocrisy was staggering. After 3 days away, I finally drove back to the first hospital to see my wife. The nurses on her floor actively avoided my gaze as I walked down the hall. I sat by her bedside for an hour, holding her cold, unresponsive hand, listening to the steady whoosh and beep of the machines that were keeping her alive. As I was leaving, a hospital administrator intercepted me, coolly informing me that they were considering pressing formal charges for the ambulance. I turned and walked away without a word, afraid of what I might say. The next morning, a man in a sharp suit introduced himself to me in the NICU waiting room. His name was Galen Woodward, a lawyer who had heard about my situation and wanted to offer his services pro bono. He laid out the potential charges in stark, terrifying detail. Grand theft auto for the ambulance, 2 counts of kidnapping, even breaking and entering. My stomach churned. But then he told me we had a strong necessity defense. He was confident that any jury in the world would understand my actions. 2 days after that, I received a call from a man named Kenneth Hardy, an investigator with the state health department. He was incensed by what had happened and was launching a full-scale investigation into the first hospital. He needed every detail I could remember, names, times, and any video evidence from the other parents. His voice was filled with a righteous anger that gave me a sliver of hope for accountability. The hope was short-lived. The same day, I learned the first hospital had formally reported Dr. Kim to the state medical board for his role in the kidnapping. His license was suspended pending their investigation. I wanted to shout his heroism from the rooftops, but Galen advised complete silence. Dr. Kim had saved my children, and his reward was the potential ruin of his career. 2 weeks crawled by. The NICU became my entire world. I knew every nurse, every doctor, every piece of equipment. Lucas had been seizure-free for 3 days. Ethan was still on the ventilator, but his oxygen requirements were slowly decreasing. Then, the call I had been praying for came. It was my wife's sister, her voice thick with tears. My wife was awake. I don't remember the drive back to the other hospital. I found her sitting up in bed, looking frail and bewildered. The first words out of her mouth were, "Are the babies okay?" I showed her the dozens of pictures on my phone. She swiped through them, her eyes drinking in every detail of her sons. I tried to explain about her heart, about the pulmonary hypertension that had nearly killed her, but she just kept asking to see more pictures. She wanted to know everything, their weight, their feeding schedules, when she could finally hold them. Her doctors explained that her heart was permanently damaged. She would need a lifetime of medication, would always be dependent on supplemental oxygen, and could never risk another pregnancy. She absorbed this devastating news with a quiet strength, her focus always returning to the tiny faces on my phone screen. 3 weeks later, I stood in a sterile courtroom for my arraignment. The prosecutor, a stern-looking man named Louis Gerard, read the charges aloud. Grand theft of an emergency vehicle valued at over $100,000. 2 counts of kidnapping. The words sounded alien, describing a hardened criminal, not a desperate father. When the judge asked for my plea, Galen answered for me, "Not guilty." To my surprise, the prosecutor stated that I was not a flight risk and, given the unusual circumstances, was not recommending bail. The judge released me on my own recognizance, with the conditions that I not leave the state and stay away from the first hospital. That afternoon, we met with Dr. Steele in a small conference room. My wife, in a wheelchair with her portable oxygen tank, listened intently as the doctor laid out the long road ahead. The boys would be in the NICU for at least 3 or 4 more months. They were at high risk for vision problems, learning disabilities, and a host of developmental delays. My wife took meticulous notes, her determination a stark contrast to the despair that was threatening to drown me. A few days later, a call from the insurance company. They were offering a partial retroactive authorization, covering about 60% of the costs. The representative spoke as if she were bestowing a great gift upon us. 60% of an astronomical number was still a crushing, life-altering debt. Galen's wife, Constance, who was also a lawyer, assured us we could appeal, but it would be a long, arduous fight. The next morning, Dina Lambert from CPS called to schedule a home inspection. Even though the boys wouldn't be home for months, I spent the next 3 days in a frenzy of baby-proofing, cleaning, and installing safety equipment. My wife directed me from the couch, her body still weak, but her mind sharp. Scott Henderson, a reporter, began calling relentlessly. He said the videos from the waiting room had gone viral. Galen was adamant. No interviews until the criminal case was resolved. A week after my wife came home, we had our first real fight. She asked me why I hadn't waited, why I had stolen the ambulance without her. I tried to explain the urgency, the certainty that there were moments from death, but she was hurt. She had woken up from a coma to find her husband and her children gone, with no one willing to tell her what had happened. I knew her fear and anger were justified, but I told her, truthfully, that I would do it all again. We ended up in each other's arms, both of us weeping from fear, exhaustion, and the unbearable strain of it all. The next day, Ethan's head ultrasound revealed the same grade 2 brain bleeds as his brother. Dr. Steele was gentle but honest about the potential for developmental delays. We clung to her words, not necessarily severe, as if they were a life raft. That night, I heard through the NICU grapevine that Dr. Kim was facing a termination hearing. I wrote a letter of support, which Galen painstakingly reviewed to ensure I didn't inadvertently confess to a crime. It took 3 drafts to get it right. Constance then informed us that the first hospital's lawyers had made a settlement offer. It was laughably small, bundled with a non-disclosure agreement. Constance saw it as a sign of weakness, a signal that they were afraid. My wife's new cardiologist laid out her future: 3 daily heart medications for life, monthly checkups, and the potential for major surgery down the road. She faced it all with a terrifying calm, squeezing my hand and whispering, "At least I'm alive to need it." The CPS home inspection was a humiliating affair, with 2 social workers scrutinizing every inch of our apartment. They left with a promise of continued monitoring until my legal issues were resolved. That night, Lucas's monitor screamed. His oxygen had plummeted, his skin returning to that ghastly blue. I watched, frozen in terror, as a team of nurses worked on him. The head nurse thrust a resuscitation bag into my hands and showed me the rhythm. My hand shook, but I learned. I had to. The next day, the district attorney, Louis Gerard, offered a deal, a diversion program. 200 hours of community service, a $5,000 restitution for the ambulance, 2 years of probation, and all charges would be dropped. No felony record. Galen advised me to take it. My wife, her hand in mine, nodded her assent. I agreed. A few days later, Scott Henderson's article was published. It was an explosive expose, complete with video evidence. The story went national. Mrs. Miles became a viral villain, a meme for heartless bureaucracy. The hospital's social media was flooded with so much rage they had to shut it down. We soon learned that Mrs. Miles had been placed on administrative leave. The hospital issued a vague statement about reviewing protocols, a classic non-apology. It didn't feel like justice. A week later, I saw Dr. Kim in the hospital cafeteria. He looked tired, but he smiled. He'd received a formal reprimand, but had kept his license. He'd taken a position at a smaller, less prestigious hospital, but said he was happier that he could finally practice real medicine. We didn't need to say much. We both understood the cost and the reward of that terrible day. The best day of that entire ordeal was when my wife was finally cleared to visit the NICU. Seeing her reach through the portholes to touch her sons for the very first time was a moment of pure, gut-wrenching beauty. Tears streamed down both our faces as she whispered promises to them. The final bill from the insurance company arrived. Our portion was over $200,000. A financial counselor laid out a 30-year payment plan. We applied for every form of financial assistance we could find, swallowing our pride as we laid our finances bare for strangers to judge. The boys faced more hurdles: retinopathy of prematurity that threatened their eyesight, a heart valve issue for Lucas that thankfully resolved with medication. Ethan, however, required laser eye surgery. After 10 grueling weeks on a ventilator, Ethan was moved to a CPAP machine. Seeing his face without the tape and tubes for the first time was like meeting him all over again. Our lives became a blur of medical appointments, therapy sessions, and mounting bills. My job was hanging by a thread. We were living minute to minute, held together by sheer will and love for our boys. I formally accepted the plea deal in court. 2 years probation, 200 hours of community service. Walking out of that courthouse, a free man, felt like a miracle. Kenneth Hardy's state investigation concluded, finding the hospital $500,000 and forcing a complete overhaul of their emergency protocols. It wasn't enough, but it was something. After 14 weeks, my wife was finally discharged for good. After 16 weeks, Ethan came home. Our living room was transformed into a miniature hospital wing. The first night was a chaotic symphony of alarms and tangled tubes. We were exhausted zombies, but he was home. 2 weeks later, after 18 weeks in the NICU, Lucas joined him. Our family was finally, terrifyingly, under one roof. We took the hospital's second, larger settlement offer, $75,000 and an ironclad NDA. We needed the money more than we needed to tell our story. One day, I left an anonymous thank you card for the janitor at the first hospital. 6 months later, I had coffee with Dr. Kim. We talked like old friends, two fathers bonded by shared trauma. I started a journal, pouring out the fear and rage and moments of grace from our journey. 8 months after it all began, our boys were hitting their milestones. We were $300,000 in debt, but we were alive. We were together. And in the end, that was the only metric that mattered.